Today, in a very brief Roach Reflections, I want to talk about two fish that cause a lot of problems. Neither of them are roach, but they do get mistaken for roach. And those two fish are eyed, which is also known as Orfe or silver Orfe, and the ornamental version is a golden Orfe, and you sometimes hear about blue Orfe. And the fish that they get confused with are Roach Chub hybrids. Now, in a lot of waters, these fish are very rare. I've only caught maybe half a dozen of each. Of the eyed, I've only ever caught one natural one, about 12 ounces. And I've probably caught about 5 golden Orfe, or ornamental versions that are fairly pretty, but nothing like a Roach Chub. Now, when it comes to Roach Chub, I suspect I've caught about half a dozen, and 5 of those have been this sort of size. And when you catch a fish that's that small, and Roach Chub are not that easy to distinguish when they're small. When you see a much bigger one of 2 or 3 pounds or more, you start to think that's a funny looking fish. It's not right for a chub, and it's not right for a roach. It's not deep enough for a roach, but the mouth is a bit small. And if you get one of half an ounce or so, you might just think, oh, it's a skinny little roach or something like that, not quite shaped right. And I can remember sort of 40 years ago catching a couple of these fish on the Thames at Oxford and thinking, I think that's a Roach Chub hybrid. I didn't know enough about those hybrids at the time to really be sure. And I think I've had 1 or 2 out the Stour over the years. And then last week I caught one of around about, I suppose, 8 or 10 ounces. And it was crystal clear that that's what I'd got. I'd got a Roach Chub hybrid. I didn't have a stills camera. I did have a camcorder, so I've photographed it. I can take still photographs of it. And funnily enough, the day before, someone had put up on, I don't know if it was Facebook, a picture of an eyed that they'd caught, and of course lots of people weighed it in, that's a Roach Chub hybrid, and it was nothing of the sort. So what's the big difference between these two fish that people get so wrong? Well, the massive difference is that eyed have quite small scales, and because they've got quite small scales, there's lots of them. So if you get a good clear photograph of an eyed and do a scale count along the lateral line, which is the scales with the little pits in there that you can see a little dark mark, you will get a figure that is up in the high 50s. The reference books say between about 55 and 60. So if you're getting something like 57 or 58, and it's not always absolutely clear, that number, when you get right down towards the tail, the last couple of scales, it's not easy to count, and where do you start is not always that clear. But you're going to get that number in the high 50s. Now, if you take a Roach Chub hybrid, roach, although the reference books give a scale count of between 40 and about 48, 49, and it is possible, believe it or not, to get a roach with a scale count much lower than that, because you can incredibly rarely get a mirror roach, so the scale count might only be sort of 20 or something. But by and large, roach have a lateral line count of around about 41 or 42. Rudd are very slightly lower than that, more like 39 or 40. It's about 41 or 42. And with chub, again, there's this kind of range that they give, but mostly they're around about 46. So what you find when you look at these pictures of Roach Chub hybrids is that the lateral line scale count is around about 44. So it's roughly in between. It's not exactly in between, but it's roughly in between. It's certainly not 58. So do that count and just see where it lies. Now, some roach are they're not very deep, they're fairly slim, they're more rounded shape, and they're still true roach. And you've got to learn to tell those from a roach, not jumping. Every roach that you're catching, especially on some still waters, it's a roach chub hybrid. That's not going to happen. And sometimes with chub, they always used to say there's two sorts of chub. There's the pretty chub, because a roach chub hybrid is actually a very pretty fish. It picks up that red in the fins from the roach. So it's an incredibly good looking fish, really. But you do get chub that are quite pretty. They often have that dark in the tail, a little bit of black there, and a bit of pink in the fins. But you also get chub that the sort of bronze chub. And even in the same water, you'll get these two sorts. So the chub is very bronze. The fins are just a sort of a little bit of lemon in there. Just watch out on those colorations. So that's the big clue. Just do the scale count. You're going to know one way or the other. Sometimes even the experts get caught out. Back in 1973, believe it or not, someone reported a fish of £3.14.5 from the River Chew that either comes into or goes out of Chew Valley Lake near Bristol. And it was said to be a new record roach. The record at that time in 1973 was £3.14. This fish was £3.14.5. The only thing was, because the only pictures that were in the angling press it was a strange orange colour. There's a clue. And when you looked at it, you thought, there's no way that the scaling is wrong. It's not a roach. It can't be a roach. And it was quickly identified as a golden Orfe. And there wasn't a record for an eyed or an Orfe at that time. So it actually got accepted as the first record eyed or Orfe, whichever. And that record was subsequently broken a few times. I without looking it up, I don't know what it is, but it's up around £8. It didn't take long before it got up there. So a 2.5 or £3 eyed or golden Orfe is not as significant as a 2.5 pound or £3 roach. So there's one difference. Roach chub hybrids have been caught to over £4 in this country. The water where they're most prolific seems to be the River Ribble. Why that is, I don't know. It must be to do with where they spawn in that river, and the conditions must have been right one year where the roach and the chub spawned together. Maybe a lack of good spawning sites that caused that problem. But that's a water where you are really likely to get one. I've never heard of any from the river, the Hampshire Avon. They certainly exist in the Trent. They certainly exist in the Dorset Stour. And hybrids are fairly uncommon in the Dorset Stour. They do exist there, but it's quite rare to get one. Eyed came into this country. You got the ornamental ones, the golden Orfe, to stock people's ornamental ponds, garden ponds, so through aquarium suppliers. But also around about 50 years ago, we'd had the roach disease in this country, columnaris, in the late 60s, and some water authorities of the time found that they could import hundreds of thousands, even millions of roach from Belgium and Holland. There was a lot of rumour that they were coming from Denmark, but they do seem to be coming from Belgium. And amongst those hundreds of thousands of roach, there were eyed, and these got established especially in the Yorkshire rivers and in the Trent. And there's been breeding populations of eyed ever since. So there's some of an explanation for these being there. I've never seen any in the my local Dorset Stour, but it doesn't mean that some couldn't get in there from ornamental ponds, or someone draining down a pond in their back garden and so I don't want to kill the fish, I'll release them in the wild, which is not a very clever thing to do. It's illegal as well. fact, the last time I caught a golden Orfe was from a Wiltshire pond that is fed by a small stream, and that water isn't meant to have golden Orfe in it, and someone probably got to the road bridge on the stream just 50 yards from the pond and dropped it in there, and that's how I came to catch it. I think one or two more in there. So I hope I've helped people identify these two fish. Look at the pictures carefully, and I've put some facts and figures about them as we go along. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye for now.